Hello and welcome to the next episode of Fridays with Fintelekt. I'm joined today by Christiaan Barnard, head of the New Zealand FIU, which operates under the New Zealand Police. Christiaan, thank you so much for joining us today. And at the outset, may I request you to spend a minute just introducing yourself to our listeners?
Sure. So my name's Christiaan Barnard, and I am the manager of the Financial Intelligence Unit in New Zealand. I've been with the FIU since July of last year, although because, as we'll go into, New Zealand as a law enforcement FIU, I'm a career police officer. So I've come from a background leading organised crime teams as well as serious crime teams. And I previously worked in the FIU as a supervisor, so I've come back into it with a really good knowledge of what our customers are looking for in terms of the product that we're looking to send out, and certainly it's been really refreshing coming back into the FIU, having been away from the unit for about 4 years.
Excellent. Thanks, Christiaan. So, Christiaan, the New Zealand FIU has really been set up as a law enforcement type of FIU, and it fulfills the requirements set out by the AML Safety Act of 2009, which came into force in 2013. So, could you just give our listeners a quick overview of the FIU, maybe some of the challenges you faced since it was formed, and how it has successfully brought together the financial sector, banks, the reporting entities, both from a regulatory as well as from a development point of view to fulfill its obligations?
Sure. So New Zealand is a small country, and our government is probably relatively streamlined in comparison with some of our larger partner or other countries. So we only have one police force, which is the New Zealand Police. There are other law enforcement functions that are undertaken by other government agencies, but the police is the largest, with 10,000 police officers and about another 2,000 employees. The other side to it is that because of the relatively low levels of corruption, we score generally sort of at the number one or the number two spot now in the transparency ratings, and it means that the police is a suitable place for the FIU to be housed. And what that means is that we are very closely working on very closely with our customers. So within the police, we have our district organised crime units. We've got the National Organised Crime Group, and also our money laundering teams and our asset recovery units. And because we are housed all in the same organisation, it just means that it's much easier for us to get traction for investigations in terms of referring what we see as money laundering or criminal offending. But then also we are quite integrated in that those groups have direct access to a lot of, or the majority of, our financial intelligence, and they are using them in their investigations. In terms of the broader structure, we are simply an FIU. The supervisors sit within other government agencies. So in New Zealand, the Act itself is the AML CFT Act is administered by the Ministry of Justice, but then we have the Reserve Bank that is responsible for the Reserve Bank, which is our central bank, is responsible for our banks and insurers. We have the Financial Markets Authority, who are responsible for our financial advisors and stock, anyone involved with the stock market, derivatives issuers and the like. And then we have the Department of Internal Affairs, and they have quite a mix of reporting entities. So they have the casinos, money remitters, cash transporters, and they've also taken on board all of the DNFPPs as part of our phase 2, so our lawyers, real estate agents, and accountants. So, but we work very closely with those three agencies, and especially when they have a need to undertake compliance checks in terms of us supporting them through giving them an indication as to the nature and quality of the financial intelligence. All the suspicious activity and suspicious transaction reports that are being submitted, and we meet with them regularly and have a very good relationship.
Right. So, Christiaan, the NRA, or the National Risk Assessment, was conducted in New Zealand last year. Could you take us through the methodology and also maybe share some of the key findings really related
Mm.
to threats and vulnerabilities, both domestic, international, and also maybe some of the sector risk assessment?
So this is the third iteration of our national risk assessment. The sector supervisors have also undertaken their own sector risk assessments. So the NRA in terms of methodology drew upon the previous work that had been undertaken, the previous two versions of the risk assessment, the sector risk assessment. But in terms of establishing and updating our vulnerabilities, a range of workshops were held with both sector supervisors and other interested government agencies, and also with the private sector as well. In terms of establishing what threats, what we used to inform our threats, it was primarily done through desk-based reviews, reviews of our intelligence products, reviews of our investigations, and certainly any in post-termination reports. So there was that were used to inform the threats. Now, in terms of the findings, we have identified that the two offences that carry the greatest risk of money laundering in New Zealand is drug trafficking and fraud. Tax evasion also is an area that has been of concern, but certainly from a policing perspective, the drug trafficking and which is valued that there's an economy is valued at about 750 million New Zealand dollars annually, and fraud is valued at about 400 million dollars annually. So, in terms of the money laundering risk, and our typologies that we've identified as being the most prevalent, or the ones that are the highest risks, are money remittance, and I guess particularly in the context of drug trafficking, where a lot of our methamphetamine is brought in from offshore, it's manufactured in foreign countries, and there is a need for money to be moved offshore, and we have quite an issue with our either underground remittance or small remitters behaving in ways that are contrary to the Act by moving money on behalf of organised criminal groups. But then also domestically, we see real estate being used as quite prevalent for money laundering. And then cash as well continues to be, probably like most jurisdictions, to be a significant risk. So when we're looking at our asset forfeitures, the two categories that dominate are real estate, followed by cash seizures.
Right. So, Christiaan, you spoke about the tax evasion as being one of the major risks. Can you share some of the steps taken to ensure that some of the DNFBBs or let's say gatekeepers are not misusing their positions?
Yeah, with the DNFBBs and the gatekeepers, it's actually in the New Zealand context, it's not so much the tax evasion hasn't been the biggest concern. We've got a legacy issue around trust and company service providers, and certainly it was recognised about 10 years ago that New Zealand was being used. New Zealand corporate or legal structures were being used offshore to facilitate transnational organised crime, and that was there were some weaknesses in our the way that we around the beneficial ownership for our legal structures, which did result in some high profile and somewhat embarrassing incidents that brought it to the attention of the government here. For example, in 2012, there was a plane that was stopped in Thailand that was transporting munitions to North Korea, and the company that had rented the plane was a New Zealand registered company. Now, of course, they simply have a nominee director and a nominee office here, but there's actually no other footprint here in the country, and we've seen that as well with requests that we've received from overseas for other forms of transnational organised crime, where New Zealand structures have been used to open bank accounts in high-risk jurisdictions and facilitate a range of offences. So the steps that were taken to mitigate that was there was amendments made in 2015 to the Companies Act, where there was a requirement to have a resident director and a number of other checks and balances were put in place to ensure that to ensure that beneficial ownership information was reported at the time of registration, and then also in 2016 with the Panama Papers, we had subsequent to that there was a review that was done. It was referred to, it was known as colloquially as the Sherwin report, that highlighted issues with our foreign trust or use of foreign trusts in New Zealand, and so that brought about the creation of a foreign trust register, where there's a requirement for the beneficial owners of trusts to be recorded and held by Inland Revenue, which is who deal with our tax, and that resulted in a significant number of the foreign trusts being deregistered, and there's only a handful of them compared with before the changes were made before the introduction of the register, which really, I guess, demonstrated that once you shine a light on these things, it sort of seemingly evaporated a lot of the nefarious activity that was being used, that the foreign trusts are being used for, and certainly in terms of the Companies Office, they have systematically worked through and struck off hundreds of companies that they believe, even though there's no offending link to them, but that they, but through their own investigations, have determined that it's likely that there is some risk being carried with these companies, and they don't appear to have any New Zealand footprint.
Right. And Christiaan, speaking about some of these suspicious activity reports, which you've been seeing over the last few years, are you happy with the quantity of reports received, or do you believe that more stringent customer due diligence needs to be carried out by certain reporting sectors that will lead to more reports being filed? And also, does the quality of the reports received actually enable you to disseminate them quickly to the appropriate agency for action, or is there some scope for improvement there with all the reporting entities?
So what was, certainly there has been a trend in terms of the increase in the quality. In fact, I've been quite impressed by some of the reporting that we've received, where they've identified, some suspicious activity, but rather than simply identifying the activity, they've actually invested quite a significant amount of time conducting their own inquiries and pulling on a range of sources and effectively sending it through what would be a view, is almost an intelligence report that you can almost forward straight on to investigators. So the numbers have been pretty static. We receive about 12,000 suspicious activity reports annually, and that's a figure which is, it's sort of ranged between 11,000 and about 14,000 over the last 7 years, since 2013, when the Act fully came into force. And it's always, in terms of the quality, it's always a challenging thing for reporting entities, and because they don't have access, of course, to the same amount of intelligence that the police have access to, and they're very much reliant on the questions that they're asking the customer at onboarding, and then any open source information that's available, and then any services that have been paid for. But of course, if you've got some very motivated people out there who are quite determined to be deceitful, and of course, that can sometimes be challenging for them to detect. There are some things in play that certainly assist with that. So, for example, the police, across the police, we're continually serving financial institutions with production orders in relation to criminal offending. So, of course, with that, they get a name and they get an offence on the production order. So that, of course, should immediately cause them to commence enhanced customer due diligence on that customer, and to confirm whether or not there is anything nefarious going on from their perspective. That carries with it, though, of course, the risk of tipping off the customer, and certainly in more serious cases, we will work with our reporting entities to avoid that from happening. To enable them to sort of manage the risk, while at the same time enabling us to investigate. We also collect there is also prescribed transaction reporting. So we collect every single international funds transfer over $1,000 and every single cash transaction report of $10,000 or more. And so we receive annually about 5 million transactions. That data, there's some additional challenges around how clean that data is. And so often when we're looking to use that data, there has to be a degree of cleaning it up before it can be used, as you know, because of the variations in names and details that are provided. But it certainly has proven to be quite also a very rich data source.
Right. So moving to maybe a potentially tricky subject. So, at a global level, do you think that the FATF process for mutual evaluation and ranking of countries is democratic? Especially you find that many countries have fewer resources in terms of funds, trained people, or access to technology. So do you think all countries should be painted with the same evaluation brush, or should there be different methodologies for countries with different challenges? Also, I mean, I know that FATF is, put out a public consultation, so I think it's in the process of revising its methodology now. But I'd love to get your views on that.
Yeah, it's certainly, I mean, it's timely for us because we're in the middle of a mutual evaluation. And we had our on-site back in March, and then and so we're in the process of reviewing the first draft. In terms of, I guess, overall feedback around the mutual evaluation process, I think that one thing that's not factored into the mutual evaluation is the overall risk posed by different jurisdictions, and that, depending on the economic footprint the country has, will actually have a greater impact on the risk, particularly from a transnational organised crime perspective. And yet, so for a country like New Zealand, where we've of just a few million people, and yet we are sort of ranked against financial centres such as the UK or the United States, and there seemingly is no way to, I guess, account for that disparity, because of course when there's a risk identified in one of those larger jurisdictions, that presents a much greater risk to other jurisdictions compared to, say, somewhere like New Zealand, where we're much smaller, and so when the risk is identified, there's no sort of proportional way of measuring the impact of New Zealand's money laundering on the rest of the world.
Right. So, Christiaan, in the recent past, public-private partnerships have, become more and more talked about, and we have cases from the US, from the UK, from Singapore, with varying degrees of success of how these have worked. But I believe New Zealand also has a public-private partnership. So, could you describe how it functions and take us through some of the outcomes?
Yeah. So. In 2017, the trial commenced for our public-private partnership. So ours is at this stage is a small number of members. So we've got the New Zealand Police and New Zealand Customs, but in saying that Customs has 1,000 customs officers, New Zealand Police is 10,000 police officers. So that in itself gives us quite broad law enforcement coverage nationally, in terms of covering. Having a quite good representation in terms of the overall criminal offending or environment that we're trying to work in. But then we also have the 5 major banks as members, and so they have 89% of the market share for banking. And so we are working through both tactical and tactical and strategic projects with the banks. So from a strategic perspective, each of the banks is taking on a subject or a topic that's a risk topic that we're going to use to feed into our national risk assessment, and we are working with them. And so the topics we're currently working with the banks are child exploitation, virtual asset service providers, trust and company service providers, and human trafficking. And then from a tactical perspective, we are engaging in exchanging providing them with personal information of targets, so when we have a COVID operation that's pending, we've vetted members of the banks that are able to receive operational information that we provide them, and then all that we can do is we can only ask them to then feed that into their risk understanding of that customer. So we can't actually tell the banks what to do with the information, but what we can do is say, this person is under investigation for money laundering. Now that you know this information, you now have obligations under the Act. And if they do a review of that person's accounts and can't find anything unusual, then they're not going to report anything. But of course, if they do a review and identify transactions that actually are either consistent with the offending that's being alleged, or that actually that fall into the category where it should be report that occurs. So that in turn stimulates STAR reporting on some of our active targets, and that is so it goes towards addressing that issue I talked about earlier, where you have the banks or the reporting entities, not just the banks, but all reporting entities do have those challenges around actually identifying who is a nefarious actor and who isn't, particularly when you've got people who are out there intentionally trying to deceive them. But the relationship, the Financial Crime Prevention Network relationship is progressing really well, and we'll be looking to expand the membership of the group, and then also look at how we can best leverage off the group to get the best possible strategic and tactical outcomes. Right,
excellent. So, Christiaan, what would you say are some of the critical success factors for the country in ensuring that the AML CFT risks are actually minimized in a sustainable manner?
I think the key thing from an enforcement and a compliance perspective is focusing on those identified risks. So for us, remittance is a key area and that's a priority area for the Department of Internal Affairs in terms of actually bringing in remitters into the fold and making sure that they are undertaking the AML CFT obligations. But then also from a law enforcement perspective, actually, aggressively prosecuting complicit professionals. And certainly in the New Zealand context, we have, our money laundering team has prosecuted, is prosecuting a number of different professionals. We've had, including car dealers, accountants, and people working in money remittance, and and these are people that are at the very top end who are actively working as part of an organised criminal group to facilitate money laundering on behalf of organised crime groups.
Right. And Christiaan, in closing, what would you say are some of the notable achievements of the New Zealand FIU that you're really proud of? And what are your ongoing expectations from banks and other reporting entities?
So, I mean, the FCPN is something that I'm really, really proud of the progress that we're making in terms of that public-private partnership. It's a really important relationship for us, in terms of having that ongoing engagement with some of our key reporting entities. So that's certainly, from my perspective, is something that I'm very pleased with how that's progressing. The other area as well is the work that we're doing. The New Zealand Police has, as a whole, has 5 targets, one of which directly relates to our business. So there's quite a broad number of targets. So there's a 5% reduction in the road toll is one. They want to reduce serious criminal offences by 10,000 counted offences. They want, there's a push to get 90% trust and confidence in our customer surveys. We want to reduce reoffending by our Māori, who are our Indigenous people here in New Zealand, by 25%. And then also finally, we want to restrain $500 million in assets. And so, of course, that particular target is one which has been really key for us, and certainly working alongside our asset recovery units and our organised crime groups. And we're currently tracking really well. And most recently, there's a restraint that we made for 140 million New Zealand dollars, which was that related to an offender who was arrested in Greece, who was then extradited to France, and is now and we found a whole lot of assets here in New Zealand. And that was just one really good news story that of a number in terms of some of the work that the FIU has directly contributed to in terms of achieving our goal of restraining 500 million in cash and assets by 2021.
Right, and any sort of expectations from your reporting entities? Anything you want to say to them?
Well, yeah, certainly for the reporting entities. I mean, I am really pleased with the engagement that we're having across the sectors, and it certainly is. And I acknowledge that it's been challenging for some of our phase 2 entities. It's they've only been our phase 2, which is our lawyers, real estate agents, and accountants, have only been progressively brought into the Act over the last couple of years, and so for them it's quite a major change in their way of thinking. But certainly, I have staff that are engaged with delivering training on the reporting of suspicious activity reports, prescribed transaction reporting, and they have been very impressed with the high degree of engagement. And of course, I'd like that to continue. The key thing is, I think for any reporting entity is having a culture from the very top of anti-money laundering. It's something which you can't just have go, well, this is a piece of legislation I must comply with, therefore I will now appoint a compliance officer. What you need to have the CEO and the board of directors right at the very top having that mindset, and it's a culture that's driven through the organisation, because that is how these, certainly from it, there should be some interest, some self-interest in having that viewpoint, because when you only need to look to some jurisdictions, most recently in Australia, where we've seen some very large banks prosecuted for AML failings, and I can't help but think that from a leadership perspective, if the CEO and the board of directors, and the leadership team of a lot of these of a number of reporting entities are really bought into AML, and it permeates through the business, then it's going to improve the quality of the reporting, and it's not just a tick the box, but they'll be actively seeking out people that are actively using the financial system in order to launder money. But that's probably probably a key message from my perspective, is just that, is actually making sure that the companies, the reporting companies, that the leadership have a culture of AML, and that it's not just treated as something that's bolted onto the side, and it's a piece, and effectively something that they're required to do, because it is important. They, as good corporate citizens, where they need to be well engaged to protect our financial system as much as the public services in terms of law enforcement and the sector supervisors.
Excellent. Christiaan, thank you so much for joining us today on this session. It was great having you, and I think it's going to be very interesting for our listeners. So thanks a lot. I appreciate the time you spent.
It's great. No, my pleasure. Thank you very much for the time.